off. Evening, everybody. Bit of a change of scenery. We're in my study because study. It's not a study. It's a playroom. It's the kids' playroom. Wife's in the kitchen doing some work. Didn't really want to disturb her, and yeah, I feel like I'm kind of under the spotlight when she's in the room anyway. Like I need to perform for her, like some whiskey drinking monkey. So finishing off the island whiskies. So we've done Skye with Talisker. We're not doing Islay, we're going to save that for later. We've done Orkney with Highland Park and Scapa. We've done Arran. We did, what did we do yesterday? What did we do yesterday? Crap. Oh, Tobermory, of course. No, Tobermory and Lechek, which is just uploaded. So basically the only one that's left that I can think of that is operational fully is Isle of Jura. Now, this one is a slightly older bottling. This is an older miniature, but good fill level, so it's going to be as was at the time. This is what the standard Isle of Jura looks like now. The Origin is called, but it's still a 10-year-old, of which this is a 10-year-old. And as far as I'm aware, when they changed the packaging, they didn't really do much to the actual whiskey itself. So Jura is here, and it is slap bang next door to Islay. I think it's pronounced Feshiel. Big Islay festival that they have that was last month before, and Jura basically gets in on the act because it's so close. It's like, well, we might as well join in the festivities with you. So it was originally the distillery itself on the island, which is in the sort of biggest town stroke village called Craighouse, which is kind of like the capital. It's a bit like Tobermory on Mull. It's essentially the capital of the island. The distillery was founded by a guy called Archibald Campbell in 1801, but in the mid 1700s there was actually distilling going on that wasn't illicit. It was, they actually had permission for personal consumption, essentially, and then in the late 1700s there was it was banned. But kind of like, no, you can't do this anymore. 1801, the distillery was founded. 1824, I think, was when they got the license, when the License Act came through. But in 1901, it was then fully dismantled, basically because of a dispute between the landowner and the current distillery owner, whose names I can't remember and I didn't write down. So the Jura that we know was actually completely rebuilt on the original site in 1963 by two guys that owned land on the island, whose names were Robin Fletcher and Tony Riley Smith. Yes, not a particularly Scottish name, that one. Very, very kind of Southern English. Anyway, I digress. They were helped out financially by Scottish and Newcastle, who were a brewing company, but also had sort of a blending part of their business that was called Charles McKinley and Co. And there is a blend out there, or I don't think you can find it anymore. I think it might be still around, called McKinley's. And it was the guy that kind of designed, the architect for the distillery was a guy called William Delmay Evans. Again, doesn't sound very Scottish because he isn't. He was actually Welsh. But before he did Jura, he actually set up the Tullibardine distillery. And he was almost Scottish by nature rather than Scottish by nature, Scottish by nature rather than Welsh. He actually learnt to fly so that he could fly to and from Jura. So he was quite heavily involved, I think, until the mid to late 70s in the distillery in terms of the running of it. So Charles McKinley and Co. were essentially the owning company. They were bought by Invergordon in 1985. White Mackay then bought them in 1993. White Mackay are now owned by a Philippine spirit company called Emperador, but White Mackay technically still own it. They do Dalmore and a few other places as well, and we'll come across to them as we do the rest of the Highlands and then go into Speyside as well. So although it's slap bang next to Islay, it's quite a different beast. They don't really have the sort of intensity of peatiness. They do have a little bit of peatiness, but it's more kind of like naturally occurring rather than really pushing it in terms of we want peated whiskies, this is our style. Jura there's a smokiness there, but it's never been particularly overpowering, it's never been particularly medicinal, it's very, very subtle, and it's almost kind of like slightly oily and softer. Essentially, they're doing, they've done it to stand out. That's like, well, Islay, they're there, literally next door. They're doing all these peated whiskies. Why are we trying to compete with them? Let's stand on our own and let's do our own characteristic. That's not to say that they don't do peated whiskies. They have experimented with one. They do a particularly good one called Superstition, which came out I think that came out in the early 2000s, like 2002, 2003. And I can remember when this went from this bottling to the much, much nicer bottling. The bottle shape stayed the same. It's basically the labelling, as it were, is much, much nicer in this new version. And I think it was about the turn of the millennium, maybe just before. Couldn't find anywhere where it was, the date was, yes, this is when it changed. But if anybody does know sort of roughly when it was, I think it was about maybe late 90s, like 98, 99. So obviously this is an older bottling, but I've got it. It's in my possession, so I'm going to do this as Islay Jura. But Superstition was a combination of heavily peated and very lightly peated versions of Jura together, and it was absolutely phenomenal. I remember when it first came out and I was like, well, the bottle looks good, we're going to give this a go. And it was super stuff, really, really good. Now, my father-in-law does not like peated whiskies at all, and yet I got him a bottle of Superstition. Essentially, he didn't realise, and he loved the stuff. He thought it was absolutely fantastic. So they are doing some experiments with more heavily peated versions. There is a lot of versions. Jura is one of these that when it had the relaunch and the rebranding, there seemed to be quite a lot of different versions coming out. George Orwell apparently wrote, if not all, a lot of his novel 1984. They did a 1984 release. There was all sorts of stuff in there. So very highly regarded, very well considered. It doesn't really hang off the coattails of Islay. Actually stands on its own regard. For the standard 10-year-old, the Origin that you can get on the shelf, you're looking at between 25 and 30 quid for that, and you'll find it in most supermarkets. And when you get to Christmas, I think I've seen it for about 20 quid, 22, which is a good price. That's a really, really good price for that. So, as I say, I don't think this is too dissimilar to the version that you'll find out there. When they did the rebranding, I think it was more packaging rather than the actual whiskey itself. So on the nose, there is a very, very, very distant smokiness, but it's not, you wouldn't even call it obviously peated or anything like that. But it is slightly oily, and it's almost like an orange marmalade. There's a slight orangey bitterness to it, and it's not orange peel. It's like coarse cut orange marmalade. Really, really nicely rounded on it as well. It's a very classic whiskey nose, to be honest, on this. Not overly malty, it's slightly fresher than that. But there is just this there's an oily smokiness to it. %40 as well. And I'm sure the standard Origin is 40% too. They might have upped it to 43. But really easy drinking. And again, there's a very, very slight smokiness, but it's not anywhere near a even softly peated either. It's just there in the background. Again, there's a slight bitterness to it, and almost a touch of burnt toast, but the really burnt bit of burnt toast. But it's not unpleasant, it's just there in the background. There's some really good flavours on it. It's really, really easy drinking. It's a cracking entry-level whiskey, in all honesty. It ticks a lot of boxes for what you would want from a whiskey in terms of it's very easy drinking. There's a nice heat to it, but it's not overpowering. There's a good depth of flavour, but it's not massively complex. It's not going on for hours. The finish is nice and warming, but it's not overly complex, but it doesn't need to be. It's a very, very good whiskey as a whole. It's got everything that you would want from a generic whiskey, and that's not a bad thing, because what it does really, really well. Things like the Superstition that was when it started doing something slightly different, which was really interesting and fantastic stuff. And that would, you'd start here and then you'd move on. And that's exactly what something like a 10-year-old should be. Something like the standard 10-year-old release, or an 8-year-old or 12, or whatever the distillery chooses to do as their entry level, is the introduction to. These are some of the core flavours that you'll find from Jura as a whisky, and we have these other ranges for you to then go and explore. Because if you like this, we think you're going to like these slightly different versions that will take you into a different direction. It's got everything you want from a whisky, from a really, really good, solid, dependable whisky. And if you can find it for 22 quid, I mean 25 quid's a really good price, but if you can find that for just over 20 quid, bargain. And it looks fantastic as well. So to give that as a present, you're onto a winner in every count. Looks good, tastes good, what more do you want? Right, so that is the islands done until we get to the end of the challenge when we hit Islers. Quick rinse out, and then we shall get on to the next one, which is a little bit more unusual and a slightly different direction. So let's see you at the next one. Cheers.